classical liberals think that individuals should decide for themselves what they're going to do. They shouldn't be told what to do by the authorities. Think to themselves, well, we know that people are living wrongly and they should live a different style of life. And we should get politicians who will make them do that. I find that to be creepy in a way that I don't find the leftists to be creepy. I just think they're misguided.
Good afternoon, my name is Harrison Griffiths and I am the new Communications Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Jamie Whye, thank you very much for sparing the time to sit down with us today. So to start off, can you briefly outline the core ideological tenets of post-liberalism and its central criticisms of classical liberalism?
Well, its critique of classical liberalism is really quite a familiar one from some people on the left, at least on economic affairs. So they say that unfettered free markets and individualism lead to a kind of an ugly society, one where there's a lot of inequality and where individuals are atomized. So we're all kind of separate entities and we don't have the kind of social bonds, communal bonds, that make people feel that their life is meaningful and that they're connected to others, and that gives a sense of belonging and purpose. They think that liberalism has destroyed what you might call the fabric of society, and it's made us just a bunch of isolated individuals who do nothing but pursue kind of ephemeral pleasures and consumption.
And what do they propose as the countermeasure to this?
Well, they think that the state should play a role in rejuvenating, let's say, various social institutions, the family, the church. They like voluntary associations of the kind that flourished once, such as trade unions, friendly societies, all these things that have fallen away over the last century. They want them to be revived, and they want the government to actively do it. So now they have I don't know if I'll get ahead of myself here, but
please.
Part of their diagnosis of what's gone wrong, forget their recommendations for a moment. Actually, they're a bit thin on recommendations. They're much better on diagnosis, or they're much keener to do the diagnosis. I don't think they're very good at it, in fact. But they use the term liberalism all the time. They don't say liberty has caused this. They say liberalism has had these effects, which is sometimes a bit hard to understand what they're really saying. But under liberalism, they count both classical liberals, such as us here at the IEA, and left-wing progressive type ideas. That's the American use of the word liberal, right? So the American use of the word liberal as a term of abuse, right-wingers use it as a term of abuse. They normally meant not classical liberals, they meant left-wingers, right? Now, the post-liberals aren't making that any such mistake. They're not using it in those terms. They expressly use it to cover both classical liberals and the progressive left. And it's an interesting trick why they think we belong together under that label, liberalism. That's actually a central element of their thesis, why we actually belong together, because most of the progressive left and us classical liberals think we don't belong together, right? We disagree with each other. We think there are profound differences between us. The post-liberals think, no, you're all roughly the same, actually.
And that strikes me, learning about the post-liberal debate in general and reading your paper, as quite a core flaw in their argument. Mm-hmm. There are essential divisions in ideology and philosophy, policy, between progressives and left liberals, American liberals, and we on the sort of classical liberal libertarian side. Why do you think it is that they lump us in together? Do you think it's a mistake? Do you think it's an intentional sort of selling point?
Well, it all turns on their misreading of the notion of individualism. So they rightly see that classical liberals have an individualistic philosophy. Well, what does that mean? That means that classical liberals think that individuals should decide for themselves what they're going to do. They shouldn't be told what to do by the authorities. Now, there are always limits on this, of course. though we can't murder each other, we can't be free to do whatever we want. I'm not going to get into the details of where those proper limits are, but classical liberals think that the proper limits are small, that the widest scope should be given to individual freedom. Now, but what does that individualism mean? I said it means that you get to decide for yourself what you will do. So, for example, I decide how I'll dress, I decide what I'll eat, I decide who I'll work for, all those kinds of decisions we make for ourselves. Now, that's not how the post-liberals characterize individualism. They say that individualism is the view that the state should remove any impediments to the satisfaction of an individual's desires. So now that's completely different from the actual classical liberal view. Indeed, Whye expressly said that is not what individualism is. In fact, it really couldn't be if you think about people who are in favour of free markets. If I'm in favour of free markets, one of the things I really want is prices. We free marketeers think prices are a fantastic mechanism for getting people to use resources efficiently and for stimulating all sorts of productive activity. Now, a price is an impediment, right? I have to pay the price. No one in the free market world believes that the government should remove that impediment to the satisfaction of my desires. And when governments do remove those impediments to the satisfactions of desires, for example, by replacing the price mechanism for getting capital to invest in your company by just giving you money from tax, free market people object to that. We don't say, oh, hooray, look, the government's removed an impediment to the satisfaction of the businessman's desires. We lament it because it's coercive and it has all sorts of bad effects. So they mischaracterize individualism, the individualism of classical liberalism. But once you mischaracterize it in that way, you can easily say, oh, look, individualism leads to the growth of the state, because the state has to remove all these impediments from the satisfaction of my desires, right? So it's got to provide me with all sorts of things, and it's got to, this is the other thing they think, it's got to undermine the social institutions like the family and the church, which constrain our conduct in various ways, right? Your family helps you, but it's also a discipline on you. Churches discipline you in various ways if you're a member of them. And they think that because the state's job, according to individualists, they say, is to remove these impediments, the state is kind of at war with these institutions and erodes them.
In many ways, they're almost making our argument for us when we debate the left liberals about what it ought to mean to be an individual. Do you need to be given something to reach your sort of individual freedom in a material sense, or is it a set of political and institutional beliefs? In the defence of post-liberals, though, you do see that with the expansion of social liberalism, something the progressives and we agree on in many ways, that in your personal life you ought to be free from legal constraints to pursue your own happiness, that is often accompanied by the growth of the state, by the growth of those institutions like the welfare state, which have undermined those traditional institutions. How do you dispute that statement when so much of the West has fallen down that path?
Well, I think that the growth of the state, and I think probably the post-liberals agree with this, the growth of the state has indeed undermined many of the traditional institutions in the West, the family, the church, all sorts of voluntary associations. Now, the interesting thing that, again, the post-liberals don't talk about as far as I can see, is that these institutions flourished during the period that most closely conformed to how we want public policy to be administered, right? In the late 19th century, roughly up until World War I, the government played a very small role in society. Industry wasn't heavily regulated, there was no welfare state, so on. And these friendly societies absolutely flourished. So I think 6 million of Britain's 7 million working age men were members of a friendly society. These were effectively provided health insurance and unemployment insurance. Now, when the state started providing that, taxing us and then providing it, these institutions died off because they were being crowded out by the state. The state forces me to pay my tax and then promises to give me an unemployment benefit should I become unemployed. Well, why am I going to join a friendly society now? Because the government's doing it for me and I haven't got any money to pay the fees because I've been taxed by the government. Take single-parent families, which the post-liberals lament. These really took off in the 60s and 70s. That's when the numbers increased dramatically, not just in Britain, but in America, and especially in America with black families. Black families had the same marriage rate as white families up until the 60s. Then benefits for single parents were introduced, and this meant that it was now affordable to live, to be a single mother. In fact, it's worse than that. In the United States, a single mother could receive, in the 70s, $20,000 US a year, which is $90,000 in purchasing power now, but only if the man wasn't there. So in fact, the policy actively kept low-earning men away from the mothers of their children. I believe it's the welfare state that has had many of the damaging social effects that the post-liberals complain about. I mean, I think a lot of people complain about them too, and most people aren't happy about these. But the question is, what causes it? Now, they say, oh yes, the welfare state is part of it, but classical liberalism leads to the welfare state. And I've explained their trick for doing that. It's just a trick. The thing that I think they're doing, which is odd, and you see it very much in Philip Blond's book, Red Tory, they want to claim that this kind of single ideology that has dominated political life or the organization of society over the last 200 years, let's say, and they call it liberalism. But actually, it's much more complicated than that, right? So there are elements of, let's say, the Britain we find today. It's got elements of it that come from the pre-liberal era. I mean, the royal family, rather obviously, right? We've just been celebrating all that. You've got, and some of the laws that concerning, let's say, marriage, and there are still some about sex that are around. These are a legacy of that pre-liberal era. Then we've had classical liberal ideas have played a role in forming the country that we are today, but also left-wing, collectivist, egalitarian ideas have also played a role. And we've got it's kind of a hodgepodge, and there's lots of different elements. And these guys are trying to say, no, it's liberalism, it's all liberalism, which is just an oversimplification of the world that we actually live in.
Yes.
And the interesting question is, there are various things that people don't like houses are too expensive, let's say, or we wish more kids were raised by two parents, let's say. And then say, well, okay, what lies behind the problem? Is it an excess of liberty? Or is it governmental interference? I mean, in the case of housing, it's so obviously governmental interference that there's really no point arguing about it. I mean, in countries with free property markets, lightly regulated, houses are not expensive. Now, single parents is a more complicated matter. I think it's got many causes. People being more affluent is one. It's really a choice for people now that it didn't used to be. Some changes in social attitudes, divorce is easier than it used to be, all sorts of things.
And if I might pick up on that, when you talk about marriage breakdown in the paper, you do acknowledge, as you just have, that liberalising social norms and policies around divorce and the breakdown of the social stigma of leaving a family or being divorced must contribute in some way. But do post-liberals have a point here? In the Jamie Whye universe, where you can destroy the welfare state and have individuals freely deciding and freely responsible, crucially, for their own actions, you would, of course, likely see a decline in family breakdown. But we are still social liberals, are we not? We are not socially conservative. Do these organic social developments contribute as well, and at what level do we disagree with post-liberals on that? Do we consider a problem that actually needs addressing, or do we say, hey, that's the market, that's society, that's evolution, you have no right to plan it?
I say what you just said then. Yes, for example, another reason we got higher rates of single-parent families is the emancipation of women. Women can now work and make good money, and they aren't dependent on men. Now that's a welcome development. We liberals like that kind of thing. It has a side effect, which is that there are more single-parent families. Now, I don't claim to know what the right number of single-parent families is. Maybe it was too low in the past. Maybe once we liberalize things and women get independence and can fend for themselves economically, we're going to naturally get more single-parent families, and that's not necessarily, it's just an unintended consequence of good stuff, and it may in itself not be that harmful. My point in the paper is really to say a lot of what we lament is an effect of the welfare state, not of individual liberty. It's also important to point out that I'm not a utopian. Life is going to be, with free humans constrained by a certain amount of law, life's still going to be disappointing and messy, and all sorts of unhappy stuff is going to happen. So I'm not suggesting that if it weren't for the government, life would be perfect. Far from it. Human life will never be perfect. The question just is government involvement making things better or worse? Now, I think there is one area where we classical liberals and progressives may actually agree with each other, and I think you hinted at it, which is that I think that the progressive left do kind of agree with John Stuart Mill's view that it is not for the state to decide what is the nature of the good life, that is a matter of individual choice. I think where the left and classical liberals differ is more that they think that the state, there's something they might call genuine freedom, right? So you're not genuinely free unless you've got the means to pursue your goals, and the government must make sure that people do have those means to pursue their goals. But I think that most people on the left would want to say, no, I just want to give you the means, I don't want to tell you what your goals should be. You can live as you want to live. I mean, progressive lefts are very liberal about sexual matters, about how people's living arrangements, let's say, all that kind of thing, and they think that what job you do should be up to you, not up to the government. I mean, they're in some ways still reasonably liberal. Now that's where the classical liberals and the leftist liberals, let's say, do have common cause against the post-liberals.
Yes.
And in many ways, I find the post-liberals more objectionable than I find most lefties.
Yeah, I agree with you there, I have to say.
It's just, I don't know, the idea that some bunch of Christian guys, they're almost all Christian, think to themselves, well, we know that people are living wrongly and they should live a different style of life, and we should get politicians who will make them do that. I find that to be creepy in a way that I don't find the leftists to be creepy. I just think they're misguided. I think they've got all sorts of wrong ideas, but they're not trying to bully people. They want to help people. Now, I know that the post-liberals want to help people too. They think that they're going to save them from certain kinds of things, but I don't know, it feels different to me, and one gives me the heebie-jeebies in a way that the other one doesn't.
It's almost like the difference between the Christian who goes and works at a food bank to save people from hunger and the Christian who goes around the door telling you you're going to hell but really does insist that they are very sympathetic and that they are trying to save you in many ways, isn't it? But I completely agree with what you said on post-liberals. It's almost, even though I would absolutely agree with you that the way that the left seeks to go about social emancipation is misguided. On the post-liberal right, on the communitarian right, it's almost a brazen admission that they want to control everything and that they're not ashamed of it, whereas at least the left gives some lip service to the emancipatory potential of freed social institutions.
I think this is where...
Sorry about that.
I think this is where I said earlier that the post-liberals don't have an awful lot to say in concrete terms about policy that they would like to put in place. I mean, one thing, for example, is they want, I think, tax subsidies for marriage. They want to promote marriage through the tax system. I've heard suggestions of shops being forced to shut on Sundays, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
I think Vermeule's touched on that in the United States even.
They're not big deal. I mean, for example, in the New Zealand that I grew up in had those laws.
The Western Isles in Scotland still have those laws. It's crazy,
yeah, it doesn't amount to a major transformation of society, but I think one of the reasons that they have a relatively small suite of recommended policies is that the stuff that they'd have to actually do, like to bring about what they want, is clearly outrageous. I mean, no one's going to have it. So they say all this stuff. They've got this diagnosis, so it's all liberalism's fault for thing. And then, okay, what are we going to do about it? Well, we shut shops on Sunday. Really, that's going to do it?
Yeah.
Are you going to make divorce illegal? I mean, really? I don't think so. No. So it's a funny business, and I think its political manifestation is in, as you mentioned at the beginning in your introduction, in national conservatism.
Yes.
Now, national conservatism probably will become the norm in Western countries over the coming 10 to 20 years, is my suspicion. You can see many countries in Europe moving in that direction. If Liz Truss hadn't become leader of the Tories, I think the Conservatives might have moved in that direction. There were hints of it under Boris. I mean, he's not very ideologically clear, so it wasn't clear. And Theresa May, Nick Timothy, Theresa May's former strategist, is one of Britain's leading post-liberals.
And the transformation of the Conservative Party coalition, underrated actually under Theresa May, but fully manifested under Boris Johnson, with their more openly statist policies, with their on-the-record greater hostility towards immigration, for example. You see the same things that you see in the United States, as you say, in Europe, with the right becoming more identified with the working class populist identity and the left moving towards a more educated coalition. Do you think that the experience of Liz Truss with a general election in the UK only 700 odd days away, do you think that will be informative to other right-wing movements? If she can be successful, including in areas of the North and Midlands that are becoming more friendly to Conservatives but that we worry about, do you think that she might be able to teach us a lesson that free markets can still be popular?
I hope so. I mean, she'll have to do some pretty radical things to get any economic traction in such a short period of time. But I think from what I've seen, she's got the courage to do it. But I wouldn't get my hopes up too high. I mean, it's quite against the general trends. And I don't know what she's going to do on certain matters, how liberal she'll be about, for example, deregulation. It's all about tax at the moment. We'll see. I mean, we would need a lot of deregulation to get a radical uplift in activity. And also, I mean, she could do something very radical, like eliminate corporate tax, but I don't think she's going to do anything quite that radical. So
I can only hope.
Yeah. But I just want to make one further point. Another area where I think the liberal left and the classical liberal are closer to each other than they are to the post-liberals is on immigration, which you mentioned.
Yes. Both
tend to have quite an open attitude towards immigration, in general terms welcome it, and are comfortable with let's call it multiculturalism, right? So a society where there isn't one dominating culture. And this is another feature of post-liberals and national conservatives. They want a monoculture, and they're hostile to immigration. And that is something that those sentiments, they would lay behind Brexit to some extent. I mean, not all Brexiteers share them. I mean, there are classical liberal Brexiteers, but the popular movement for Brexit was based on those sentiments. And certainly the campaigning drew on those feelings. And those feelings are on the rise in the West, without any doubt, all through Europe, in the United States, and here in England. And they are inimical to liberalism, I think. Once you start thinking like that, you think, well, look, this society here, it's supposed to be organized for the benefit of us. Now, who are we? Well, we're some like white men from the north or whatever it might be, right? And then, so the government's job is to arrange things for the benefit of us.
Yes.
And that's not the classical liberal approach to things, right?
First and foremost, it's central planning of the workforce and the culture in many ways, isn't it?
And protecting them from competition with overseas workers.
Yes.
I mean, agricultural subsidies are another example.
Tariffs as well.
Yeah, all these tariffs. So these are all of the policies that go with pandering to that sentiment are not classical liberal policies. They're actually they're progressive left-wing policies, but directed to the benefit of a different group of people. So progressive left-wingers typically want to help minority groups, and the post-liberals and the national conservatives want the help to go to the majority group.
Yes. The declining majority as well, isn't it? That's a key theme of theirs, the decline mentality and the sort of gripes that they have about past wrongs, as they see it.
Yeah, I mean, that again is similar to the left, who are obsessed with past wrongs, but again, the difference is who's the victim.
Absolutely.
Again, it's another reason why I've got somehow more sympathy for lefties than for the post-liberals, because the lefties pick victims, well, they care more about minority groups and people who, there's some reason to think, do face some disadvantages, right? I mean, I don't think the left's got the right approach to helping those people, but I'm keener to help people who suffer socioeconomic difficulties on account of the fact that other people are hostile towards them than I am to help a majority of people who are at home in their own country. So, the post-liberals and the progressive left have something in common, which is that they want to organise society politically.
Yes.
It's just they've got a different view about how it should be organised. What makes us different from both of them is that we don't think society should be planned.
And I do want to touch on this idea of planning in the progressive sense, as you describe in your report, when it comes to the welfare state undermining traditional institutions like family, charity, church, union, friendly societies. A post-liberal may respond to that by simply saying, yeah, they were progressive status policies. They were policies that would clearly undermine the family unit by subsidising single-family households and irresponsible sexual behaviour. Our plan is to go in and reject that wholesale and say we're going to position the power of the state, economic and social, squarely in the corner of incentivising those traditional institutions to progress, grow and stay alive, basically. Now, we can talk for days as liberals about planning problems. It's a key part of our intellectual heritage. We can warn them and say, well, if you take over this institution and create all this power and capacity, what happens when the left takes it over again? But they'll say, well, they won't. We will do so well that we will be re-elected. How do you respond to that from the perspective of families are good, social institutions are good? How can you say that a classical liberal free market approach would do better by those institutions than the Minister of State in the post-liberal government? Well,
the great virtue of those institutions, which a lot of them arose in the 19th century, was that they were spontaneous reactions to specific issues at the time. And so there was an explosion of charity in the late 19th century, and all sorts of people were starting up charities for all sorts of causes. And it wasn't being organised by any authority. And if you start organising it by some authority, well, it will stop having that dynamic and responsive quality to it, right? It won't do what it used to do. So Philip Blond had this big society idea, and it was basically drawing the charitable sector into the state, which is a terrible, terrible idea. The whole point of the charitable sector is that it's free to operate, it's free to pursue the values of the donors, right? It's not organised by the state, so you can have a great diversity of charities, all independent from one another, not being orchestrated, and that's why it works. That's what's good about it. You can't absorb it into the state and still having it working. I mean, just think about it. You've got a state-authorized charity receiving maybe some tax money. Well, then, then the state tells them who the beneficiaries can be, how they can operate, what kinds of employment contracts they have to have, everything else, right? And it's just really a part of the Department of Social Welfare. In fact, it looks a lot like fascism. Mussolini said, stupidly, he said everything within the state, nothing outside the... No, I think the other way around. Nothing outside the state, everything within the state. Why he added the second bit, I don't know. But anyway, that's where they seem to me to be headed. If you want to revitalise the charitable and other voluntary sectors, just withdraw the state.
Yeah. And in many ways it strikes me as just adding an extra step. If post-liberals and classical liberals might agree that the welfare state as it is now replaces those social bonds with a sort of cold, faceless, remote bureaucracy, by having the government patronise charities, you're just adding an extra middleman in effect, aren't you? You've got that bureaucracy that's still there undermining those sort of spontaneous ties. Just one final question for you. Since sort of the mid-2000s, early 2010s, a lot of these problems that post-liberals identify, such as teen pregnancy, divorce, single-parent households, have actually been slowly on the decline in many Western countries. Do you think that there are any particular liberal policies or liberal outlooks that can take any credit for that, where we've diverged from the previous regime that saw those issues spike? And what do you think it means for the post-liberal movement? Does it critically undermine their objections? Well,
I'm not sure. I haven't looked very carefully into the explanations for those changes. They haven't declined dramatically, have they? But they've kind of levelled off. Divorce has kind of levelled off.
Yes.
And I think teenage pregnancies fallen a lot.
Yes.
No, I think the reason for that is just private learning. So people have learned that people are just a bit... The cost of getting pregnant as a teenager are much higher than they were in some ways. It's more to do with your career if you're a woman. I mean, as women have careers, it makes much more sense for them not to get pregnant. And I think that's a large part of the explanation. So it's a spontaneous phenomenon, not something that anybody organised. As for marriage, I think marriage rates are declining actually a lot, but divorce is declining a bit too. But marriage, so a lot of family formations, they're dispensing with actual marriages. But I don't think that you'll see... So you see all sorts of social phenomena occurring that nobody planned. For example, one of the causes of inequality that people don't talk about much comes again from the emancipation of women. 20, 30 years ago, a doctor used to marry a nurse, and a CEO married a secretary. Now a doctor marries a doctor and a CEO marries a CEO, and their family incomes are way higher than they would have been, and their kids are forming a kind of intellectual elite. Charles Murray has talked about this a fair bit. Now there's a social phenomenon, a change in society, brought about by something that probably most people would think is a welcome thing, namely the fact that women can go to university and get good jobs and so on.
You'd like to think so.
Yeah, and yet it's having an effect that nobody planned or expected. I don't necessarily lament it, but it's interesting.
Excellent. Jamie Whye, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. I'm sure our viewers will have found that very fascinating discussion. You can download Jamie's paper for free, with the link in the description below. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, give us a like and comment below. Do you think post-liberals have got it wrong, or do you think there's merit to their criticisms of classical liberal? Thank you very much for watching.